Okay, let's lay out some stubborn facts about the true cost of employing people with disabilities, especially around this issue of reasonable accommodation. You know, there's a lot of science about this particular topic, so here's the real story. Did you know that 2/3 of working-age Americans with disabilities require absolutely no accommodation at work? This is kind of interesting because their own supervisors and coworkers lose mindfulness of the fact that they even have disabilities at all. But about 1/3, or 33%, of people with disabilities will require an accommodation. Of the 33%, 8% require accommodations that are $0 cost. That means things like job restructuring or a change in the work schedule. 18%, however, require accommodations that cost a reasonable amount in most cases, under $600. And only 7% require accommodations that cost more than $600. I would like to take an extreme case of accommodation that costs $10,000, because that would get the attention even of a very large company. But I want us to keep in mind that a $10,000 accommodation is really unusual. $10,000 accommodation, who pays for that? Well, if that amount is reasonable, given the resources of your parent company, you do, the employer. That's the law. But what if $10,000 is not reasonable? The question becomes, what can you afford? What can you contribute? And are there matching funds available from other sources? Places like the State Voc Rehab Agency. The VA has their own Voc Rehab Agency in the case of veterans, and they too have the ability to contribute to accommodation costs. There are foundations who do this, and sometimes the vendors give discounts. Even the employee can contribute something, if they want, to the cost of their accommodation to improve reasonableness. If you have a company that's pretty large with substantial resources, it's a good idea to consider a centralized accommodation fund. If you don't, and the full cost of an amount like $10,000 fell on a single unit or division of the company, the chances of approval go way down. But it's the resources of the parent company that count. So a centralized company-wide accommodation fund is a really good idea.
Ergonomics is really about fitting the job to the person. It's designing the workplace for the majority of people to work, including people with disabilities. I think what people with disabilities bring to the workplace is that they have learned flexibility and they've learned how to adapt to environments. So I don't think that businesses should be as concerned about a person with a disability compromising the workplace and the quality of work or the production of the work. And I think there's a fear among employers and businesses that maybe the accommodations will be too expensive, and certainly we found that not to be true at all. It's little things like changing heights, changing reaches, building up handles on tools, very minor things that cost little or nothing at all.
Here's where 4 new stubborn facts come into play. Number 1, 2/3 of all accommodation requests relate to job retention. Not hiring, not the quality of work, but to job retention. If we fail to accommodate our friend at $10,000 and he becomes unable to perform, he's no longer qualified. He loses his ADA protections, and frankly, you may just let him go. That's your prerogative. But is that the right business decision? Or doesn't it depend on the cost of replacement? The complete cost of replacement hiring is computed at 38% of the departing employee's salary. That includes things like terminating the employee, recruiting a replacement, hiring the replacement, orientation and training, lost productivity, and lost benefits. Think about that. If our friend made just $26,000 a year and you say no to that $10,000 accommodation, do you know that you paid more to replace him than it would have cost to accommodate him? Second, did McMahon say something about tax credits and deductions? Yes, there are 3, and these are just federal. The architectural barriers removal deduction. That's up to $15,000 each year to improve the mobility or the transportation of employees with disabilities. Second, the disabled tax credit. Oh, that's better. That's a credit, not a deduction. That's up to $10,000. But you must be a small business, less than $1 million in gross annual revenues, or less than 30 workers. Third, the work opportunity tax credit. That's for a person with a disability, 40% of their first year's income up to $6,000, up to $12,000 if the person is also a veteran. So what's the bottom line here? If you get a request for accommodation and you're considering its reasonableness, that final decision is up to you. But before you make it, in particular before you say no, consider all of the parent company's resources, tax credits, tax deductions, matching funds, and also consider the full cost of replacement hiring in defending your good judgment.
I treated a gentleman who had incurred traumatic brain injury who, due to being hit by a car on his bike. And he ended up in rehab for a while. He had significant cognitive deficits, severe memory loss, slow motor function, slurred speech. Eventually, he wanted to get back to work, and he really valued work. His family felt that he had the potential, so we looked at what would be a match for him, and it ended up being a grocery store. He was able to follow some very basic steps, and so what we did was set up a checklist of tasks for him to do. Because of the memory deficit, he needed cueing, he needed coaching, and he needed supervision. So I did that with him, supervised him daily, did some training with the staff there at the grocery store, eventually weaned him off of the using a compensation technique such as the task list. To this day, 22 years later, I see him every week in the grocery store. He's independent, lives in an apartment by himself, has been very successful in his job at the grocery store. His coworkers really enjoy him, and he's very proud of what he does. And I'm just really proud of him and the employer for making that match.